This week, the world lost almost 1 million barrels per day of oil supply. Not because of war, not because of sanctions, not because of OPEC, because pipelines froze and almost nobody noticed. Four numbers define this entire week: 412,000, 2 billion cubic feet, 50 tankers, 260,000 barrels. And if you don't understand what that means, you're blind to just what happened in the world today of energy. Most energy analysis tells you stories. We track flows. Every week, we map what actually changed in production pipelines, shipping, and LNG. This is the week in flows. The week in flows for January 18th through January 24th, 2026. If you care about how energy actually moves, not headlines, not speeches, but physical barrels, molecules, pipelines, and choke points, this is the series for you, and you want to subscribe to us. Because every week we track what actually changed in real infrastructure. No narratives, no forecasts, no opinions, only capacity constraints and throughput. And if you want to be in the know every single week, this is where you're going to get it. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because this is our core long-form series. Let's start with the baseline. Where are we? Total world oil supply this week is 103.5 million barrels per day. Non-OPEC output is up about 1.5 million barrels per day year over year. That's a global frame. Now, let's look at what actually broke. In North America, we see a lot of freeze-offs. The dominant constraint this week was Arctic weather in the United States. Early January, U.S. crude production, 13.5 million barrels per day. That's a 3,500 barrel per day decline from December. Not policy, not prices, physics. Freeze off. The Bakken took the direct hit. Over the MLK weekend, North Dakota lost 412,000 barrels per day. Temperatures below minus 30 Fahrenheit froze wellheads, froze gathering lines, and shut down truckloads. This basin normally runs about 1.2 billion barrels per day. During peak outage, pipeline receipts into Dakota access fell about 20 to 25%. At the same time, refinery utilization dropped 11 percent points to 81%. Midwest, Gulf Coast, unplanned downtime. The result, U.S. commercial crude inventories drew down 2.5 million barrels week over week. Cushing stock was down 800,000 barrels, and that tightens it all by quite a bit. And this is a temporary but real story. On January 18th, Kazakhstan's Tengiz field went offline. A fire at a power facility forced a full shutdown and a force majeure declaration. As of now, it's still not confirmed to be back online, looking about 14 plus days. Before the outage, Tengiz was producing about 900,000 barrels per day. That's nearly 1% of the global oil supply. That's a big news. And it also produces large volumes of gas, about 18 billion cubic meters per year. So far, the markets have sort of absorbed the shock because this looks temporary. But if this drags on, hundreds of thousands of tons of exports disappear. This is the fragility of the global energy system. All it takes is one fire at one facility, and poof, 1% of the world oil supply and gas supply goes away. Now let's switch and talk about natural gas and LNG constraints. Natural gas saw the same pattern. U.S. dry gas production fell 100.5 billion cubic feet per day, down 2 BCF per day, mostly associated gas from the Permian oil wells. At the same time, Feedgas to LNG terminals was indeterminately constrained. Spot prices near Freeport and Corpus Christi spiked up $20 to $52 per MMBTU, not because the market is tight, because pipelines were physically constrained and demand surged. No permanent pipeline damage, but full recovery is not expected until early February. Outside the United States, Norway's Jan Sverdrup lost 100,000 barrels per day for 48 hours. That's small in isolation, but real. Altogether, global supply constraints this week, about 800,000 plus barrels per day. That's about 0.8% of the global output, enough to move prices. Now let's move on to maritime choke points. Now let's go on to shipping. We're looking at the Red Sea, and the Bab el-Mandeb remains still under pressure. A lot of risk there. Since mid-January, at least 50 tankers have rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope. That adds about 10 to 14 days per voyage, 20 to 30% higher freight. Insurance premiums go up 1% of whole value. About 5 billion barrels per day normally move through the Suez. AIS data shows tanker traffic down about 15%. Qatari LNG cargoes to Europe are diverted south. That constrains about 1.5 trillion cubic feet per year in LNG flows. No direct outages, but higher risk premiums are now embedded in the Brent price. This is how chokeholds move prices, not headlines. It's transit time, insurance, and route length. Let's talk about new supply coming online. On the supply side, we had one meaningful addition. Chevron achieved its first oil at the Tengiz Future Growth Project in Kazakhstan. This adds about 260,000 barrels per day at full ramp. First flow started on January 18th into the CPC pipeline at Novojesk. That's about 0.2% of global supply. It's small but structural. In North America, Permian to Gulf Coast liquids expansions, about 500,000 barrels per day of takeaway. Kinder Morgan announced $3 billion in new gas projects feeding LNG and data centers. In Canada, Trans Mountain expansion happened, 590,000 barrels per day. Coastal GasLink, 2.1 BCF per day. And globally, 25 million tons per year of new LNG capacity under construction in U.S. and Mexico. These are barrels and molecules that will absolutely shape 2027 and 2028. Let's talk prices and flows. Where did prices land? WTI is at $61.07. Brent is at $65.88. Henry Hub at $5.28. And Urals is at $54.75. West Canada Select at $45.47. Baker Hughes U.S. rig count at 543. Oil rigs 411 with an increase of 1 from the previous week. Gas rigs 122, that's unchanged. Horizontal rigs 476, an increase of 1 from last week. Canada has 226 rigs. EIA revised 2026 U.S. output down 200,000 barrels per day on storm impacts and basin maturity. Global demand growth still at 1.2 billion barrels per day. China contributing about 500,000 barrels per day. Let's look at structural risks. 3 structural risks to watch. First, a proposed 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican crude, now up to 100%. That could raise refinery costs $5, $10, $15 on heavy grades. That affects 1 million barrels per day of imports. Second, FERC has 10 BCF per day of delayed gas pipelines that caps LNG growth. Third, EPA methane rules could add about $1 to $2 per MMBTU to midstream costs. These are slow constraints, but they compound. All right, what to watch next week? Next week, watch for 4 things. Number 1, Bakken recovery. Expected to return 300,000 barrels per day by January 31st. Number 2, Red Sea reroutings, AIS data for about 500,000 barrels per day of deferred supply. Number 3, Venezuela reactivations, target about 100,000 barrels per day. Number 4, tariff implementation details. The potential impact is 500,000 barrels per day of altered imports. These signals define February capacity. These aren't opinions. This is just flows. Okay, so here's the payoff. What does this all mean, Justin? Okay, so what did these 4 numbers actually mean? Not as statistics, but as shifts in geopolitical leverage. First, 412,000 barrels per day. That's the Bakken supply offline, a basin that normally runs about 1.2 billion barrels per day, feeding U.S. refineries. When that froze, U.S. production fell, inventories drew, Cushing tightened, that temporarily weakened U.S. export surplus, and when U.S. export tightens, OPEC regains pricing power. That's weather changing bargaining power and market share. Second, 2 billion cubic feet per day. That's what was lost to U.S. gas supply. Frozen Permian oil wells, constrained LNG feed gas lines. When U.S. LNG delivers, Europe's fallback supply tightens. That raises European dependence on marginal cargoes, and that shifts leverage back towards Qatar and Norway. That's pipelines changing alliances. Third, 50 tankers rerouted around the Cape. No barrels lost, but arrivals are delayed. Longer voyages mean fewer ships available. That tightens the global tanker fleet. And when fleet utilization rises, producers closer gain a market edge and advantage. Distance becomes geopolitics. Fourth, 260,000 barrels per day. That's the new supply from Kazakhstan. That's non-OPEC barrels flowing through Russia-adjacent infrastructure that marginally weakens OPEC discipline and diversifies European supply. That's one project changing alignment. Taken together, U.S. supply tightened, European supply strained, and OPEC regained. So, this is the week in flows. Every week, we track what actually moved in the physical system. If this is useful to you, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and come back next week, because geopolitics doesn't move in speeches. It moves in pipelines, choke points, and energy flows. See you next week. Cheers.